Everyone get seated, please. Quiet, please. And here we go. Connor.
Mr. Scott. Good morning. So, as some of you may know, world-famous architect and Episcopal alumnus Robert Venturi designed our chapel for the new campus. His work, including his original chapel design from when he was a senior in 1944, is being displayed in the exhibition A Student, an Architect, and Two Chapels in the gallery on the second floor of the campus center. That exhibit, which was put together by Episcopal parent Miss Coote, is opening next Wednesday night. And although Mr. Venturi could not be present on this panel, he is going to be at that opening. And so, in honor of that exhibition, today you're going to get a chance to hear and participate in a question and answer style panel with key figures in the planning, design, and construction of the chapel we're in now. So although we're very familiar with this space, some of the design aspects and process kind of remained a mystery to us. So after we exhausted my talking points and my student-generated questions, we're going to turn it over to you, the faculty and the students, and you'll get a chance to ask questions to either the entire panel or any individual member. So without further ado, let me introduce our panel. Reverend Squire, whom you all know, was the client, so to speak, of the chapel design process. He was involved in various stages of the design. Mr. Brian Tierney, second to my right, class of 1975, is an active member of the Board of Trustees at Episcopal. He is the former publisher of the Philadelphia Inquirer. You may recognize his name as the dining hall was given in his name. Mr. John Hunter, all the way to my right, was the project architect for our chapel. He worked on site during the construction phase, and he's worked on an incredibly diverse collection of projects over the last 25 years. He's going to be our expert on the building of the chapel. To my left, Ms. Gretchen Burke. She was the chairman of the Board of Trustees during the move. She showed a particular interest in the chapel when she served as the chairman of the board, and she's also an Episcopal parent. Mr. Haynes, to my right, class of 1961, is an emeritus trustee and former chairman of the board. He received the Distinguished Alumnus Award in 2005 for his leadership in the acquisition, planning, financing, and construction of our new campus, and the lobby, as you may know, was given in his name. And so in the interest of time, I would ask you to keep your responses relatively brief, but feel free to add on to a question that was not directed at you. And so we'll start off with Reverend Squire. So as a client of the design process, can you briefly discuss what you were originally looking for and how that kind of evolved as the process went on?
My first meeting with Mr. Venturi was a great one, and when one met with him, one got a real feel for the genius of him very quickly. But he looked me right in the eye and he said, "What do you want? What do you want this chapel to be and be like?" And I said, "It needs to contain a couple of things. It needs to contain a sense of awe, which I believe it does. It needs to contain a sense of intimacy, which I believe it does. In fact, it's very large in terms of over 900 people being able to fit in this space, but he's created the space in such a way that the chapel doesn't look that big. And the third thing I indicated to him was, I don't want somebody to say, I saw something just like this down the street. That it had to have a certain quality of uniqueness. And I think you'd agree, I don't think there's anything that looks quite like this anywhere around the world. So that was it.
Thank you very much. Ms. Burke, as the chair of the board during our move, if you could discuss some of the expectations you had and visions you had for the chapel and what you thought it was going to be like.
Well, we wanted to make sure that the chapel was at the center of the campus, and we did a lot of campus planning before we even got into the design of the buildings. We all agreed that the chapel had to be at the center of our school. It's the center of our school spiritually, and we wanted it to be right in the middle of the campus, so that's why we put it right here on the highest ground on this big campus. As we went through the design process, it was really interesting and unique, I think, for a project like this, because we wanted to make sure that even though we were building all the the buildings at the same time, that they didn't look like they were built at the same time. So that's why we engaged not only Robert Venturi, who's such a well-known, internationally recognized architect, but two others, Graham Gund, who did the campus center, and Bernie Zawinski, who did the athletic center. And the three of them worked off of each other and were inspired by each other. And it was a really unique process that I don't think any other that I know of project has ever had that kind of grouping of great architects.
Thank you very much. Mr. Haynes, if you could discuss any of the major conflicts or barriers you're faced during specifically the construction of the chapel, anything that kind of came up or arose that, I imagine there were quite a few, I've been told.
Well, the Christ Chapel was controversial when it was built, designed by Vincent Kling, and it was sometimes called a Pizza Hut and other things. But it worked beautifully inside, and it was in the shape of a Greek cross, and kids could look at each other, and one of your questions is why the semicircle? Well, right. That was Robert Venturi's response to, we want the kids to be able to look at each other and enjoy each other, not be just looking at the back of a head. In any event, when he first came up with his concept design and did a model, it was not very well received by a number of people, and but it was his vision. And being a Philistine, I had no way of figuring out that it was going to turn out as wonderfully as it did. And so I said to one of the other project architects that was in charge of the project, Phil Dordai, I said, Phil, what do you think? And we had 7 architects working on this campus. And he said, every single architect has a design for this chapel in his pocket. But if you only have one chance in your life to get a world-class architect designing a chapel for you that's a graduate of the school. And if you stay the course, I think at the end of the day, you're really going to be happy. And he was so right. And I think that, there's little things that maybe would be different, but I think the end result is spectacular, particularly when you stand at the end of that campus and you look up this way.
Right, the perspective really works really well. Mr. Tierney, Mrs. Burke touched on the fact that the chapel it plays really well into the rest of the buildings on the campus. What were your hopes and kind of what did you expect out of the kind of that relationship? Like, what were you looking for?
Well, when we started the process, and when you read the history of the Episcopal that came out last year, it says the land became available. That's kind of like saying, and then there came peace after World War II or something. This was the land. There was a whole process involved in the land, and understandably a lot of tensions, a lot of people thinking, should we move or should we not move? And all those things, like in a family having those discussions, we had them, but there was quite a process. We also knew that we didn't want to have just one architect, that we wanted to have, it didn't want to look like it was all built at the same time necessarily, or at least with the same hand, the same voice. So we knew we wanted to have several. When we say Bolin Sawinski did the athletic center, I don't know how many were, they also do all of the Apple stores. They also did Bill Gates' private home, they did Pixar Studios, and they did your athletic center too. That's who Bolin Sawinski. So it's not just another firm. And Graham Gunn, equally distinguished, and the Hillier Group, which did the middle school, the upper school, the lower school, and the science building, and were the master architects. But for the chapel, I was, as a graduate of Episcopal in 1975, I was always inspired hearing about this guy, Bob Venturi, and how famous he was. And he had, I guess, won, when was the Pritzker? Was that late in the 70s? It was probably after I graduated. When did?
It was in about 93.
93, okay. The Pritzker Prize, one of the most important prizes in architecture given Bob Venturi. And I always loved the idea when I was here that he was a student here, and a lot of us thought, wouldn't it be inspirational to have something for young men and women to think, gee, as I doodle here, someday I might be doing something like the Sainsbury wing at the British Museum. The British Galleries, Art Museum. And when you go to London, look at the Sainsbury wing. That's the same fellow who did here. He's a fellow alumnus with you someday. So that inspiration was important. And the fact that Bob Venturi, in June of 2001, just when we looked at tying down the land, there was a retrospective at the Philadelphia Museum of Art of all of his work at the Art Museum, right now where the Van Gogh exhibit is. And when you walked in, the very first thing you saw was his thesis at Princeton University a new design for the chapel of the Episcopal Academy. That was the first thing you walked into, and it was around the time that we tied down the land. So it seems so great to have this famous architect who had this singular vision, to have him now take his, and the fees were very small for him. And at one point we said, you know, this is not a moneymaker for you, but wouldn't it be wonderful at this point in your life, in your career, after all the fame, where you started at Episcopal, your thesis at Princeton was a design for the chapel, not this design, but a design back then, to now modernize it and take it together. So the fact that it would be here, that it would be singular, that it would be something that expresses, you know, a vision. I'd also encourage you, if you get a chance, there's a book called Learning from Las Vegas, is that what it is? That Bob Venturi wrote. And when you look at some of the symbolism outside, Learning from Las Vegas, that came out in the 70s, check that out, or at least do a quick Wikipedia for it. You'll get a sense of his vision. So this is a world-class famous architect that did this, a world-class famous architect who did the Athletic Center, a world-class architect who did the campus center. There's a collection of interesting things that I think it's important that everybody know when you're walking through the buildings every day.
Yeah, we're incredibly lucky in that sense. Mr. Hunter, so you were on site during the construction of the chapel, and one of the most lauded aspects of the chapel is the way the light kind of pours into the room and the way the chapel kind of commands the use of light. How did you work that into when you were building the chapel? Like, what was your thought process there?
Well, if you go and look at the exhibition, you'll see a lot of series of sketches that Bob did, and I think they've been really interesting sketches for you to look very quickly at. Buildings don't come, you know, quickly. They come over a period of time, and there's an input, and there's a lot of time when things go very slowly, and then something changes, and it makes it a lot different. The idea for lighting came about because we wanted the space to be that contradictory feeling of being intimate, but also awe-inspiring. How do you do that? I mean, because they're in a way contradictory. And so what we knew we were having would be a building which was relatively compact, but we wanted it to be high. And by stepping the building up, it gave us the opportunity that where we put the steps, we could introduce light. Now, we introduce light by windows, obviously, that everybody's that's a conventional way. But the idea here is that we introduce light at high level, which in a way is behind most of you. And it's on sort of like 270 degrees. So what the light is doing is it's animating the space, different times of the year, different times of the day. As the clouds or the sun tracks across the sky, it animates the space. And that was one of the things that we thought was very important.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So with that, we'll move to some student-generated questions that we've pre-collected. A question from David Burke, Jr. is kind of, the whole panel can address this if they want. How did the visions of the chapel change as the process matured? So in the very beginning, it started out as something, and then how did that evolve? To take that.
I don't think it evolved that much. I mean, he really had, I saw Robert Venturi draw a sketch of this in the first charrette we had, which I believe was in 2002. And it was exactly this image. And a lot of people looked at it and said, that looks like a wedding cake. It looks like a pop-up building, my son thought. But that was his vision from the beginning. And what he always said to us was, great architecture is not necessarily loved by everyone when it's first seen. It's something that has to last for hundreds of years. And if everybody likes my design, then I haven't been successful.
Thank you very much for that. So one of the most common, although there's a lot of praise to the chapel, criticism is kind of, it comes along with the territory. The most common criticism that I think the vestry has received is that the chapel is very sterile and plain on the inside. And my question for, I guess, specifically Mr. Hunter, but anyone can address this and jump on, is really, is that an intentional thing, or was that a kind of an unexpected result of the process?
Well, I suppose the word that attracts my attention is the word sterile. Obviously, we don't think it is, but Bob tends to design either very plain buildings or very simple, and that usually reflects museums, where the museums are just containers for the art, and it's the art that's the centerpiece, and the architecture takes the background stands. Or very exuberant buildings with a lot of color, almost like Victorian polychrome colors. And what we thought here was that this chapel is going to be here for a long time, and that during our discussions, everybody was trying to look at all of these different things with all the different buildings. And we never got a strong sense that anybody really knew what they wanted specifically. And I think Bob was really is concerned about and uncomfortable about imposing something that he thought was appropriate that everybody would be then stuck with for the next 100 years. So the building, again, is I think more on that museum sort of track, which is that it's a container and it's fairly simple, and we hope that over time it will have added to it things that are unique to the school and to the chapel, and it will grow richer over time. Maybe not at the beginning, it might seem a little plain, but the basics are here, the sort of the wood which will mature and age well, and the simple background color and the light we talked about, and it's really up to the school to add things that really add its character and things that it will love. I mean, one of the things that we did add were certain things from the old chapel. I mean, the stained glass, which we put around the sort of secondary spaces and in some of the rooms, which I think look great. And, everybody was really enthusiastic about maintaining those. And also the cross comes from the original chapel too. But over time, we hope that, that other things will be added.
Thank you very much. You just touched on it, but Mr. Tierney, Mr. Haynes, and Reverend Squire, you were all students at Episcopal and participated in service at Christ Chapel. What connections and parallels can you draw from that original building to this one we're in now?
Well, as I said, we were trying to capture the spirit of Christ Chapel in two senses, the soaring nature of it. And Christ Chapel, of course, had, really soaring ceilings. These are very high, but they soar in any event. And also that the students would look at each other and participate. And that's why it's a semicircle. We also brought the organ out from the old chapel. And I think they were the design elements that were the driving force, those three things. And everything else flowed from that. And as Gretchen said, not much changed from the beginning to the end. And as we discovered with the athletic center, great architects are also have wills of steel.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
I'll jump in on that. The couple at different.
Turns off.
Hello? Yeah, no, it's fine. I appreciate what you said, because at different times I did think when it was done, a little color over there, or murals or something, or some artistic kind of something would, and that this is an ongoing process, and that maybe 20 years from now another generation will want to add to it is a nice way to look at it. I was in the advertising business for 15 years, so I'm used to dealing, and I wasn't the creative director, but I had hired great creative directors, and I was used to dealing with creative processes where you have to listen. It doesn't mean you agree to everything, but you definitely, I had an art director one time who said, if a client loves the campaign immediately when we present it, it probably is not a good campaign because it's something they've seen before and it won't work. So this needed to have something that would kind of, but there were difficult, I'll never forget one night, we had the challenge of, it got a little contentious at times, and one night I decided, maybe I'll take Bob Venturi and his wife Denise out to dinner with my wife Maud. We went to Jake's in Manayunk, because things were going a little bit off the track. And during the course of that dinner, I hope it's not, I did say to him at one point, Bob, do you have to be such a pain in the ass on this process? Can't you just work with me? I want you to be the architect. We want you to be with the architect. And it was great because Denise started laughing and was trying to kind of cajole Bob around it, because Bob wanted to do it. So, there's a wonderful creative tension in a process like this. And you shouldn't avoid it. It's really good. And as long as people are civil and fundamentally share the same values and the same hopes and dreams, it all works out. And that was definitely part of this process. And probably more with this building than any of the other buildings, because perhaps Bob Venturi, is of that, phenomenal level of architect globally that, you're going to have a little back and forth, and this building certainly was part of it. The building was important too because it symbolized the school. The position, as Gretchen said, it had to be here. This is the heart and soul of the school. Mind, body, spirit. And this is where it symbolizes here. So it's a place to go when something happens in America or in the world. When 9/11 occurred at Haverford School, they weren't sure where to go. We knew where to go. You come to the chapel. That's where we would go. And it plays that role in terms of the history of the school for the last 227 years, which is pretty amazing, and hopefully for the next 227 years.
Thank you.
Thank you. One of the things that occurred when we decided to move out here was that there were a number of people who really didn't want to leave that campus in Marion. And when we asked them more about that, they indicated it was really the chapel they didn't want to leave. Because when you think about it, and you all know just from this past year, here in this place, we celebrate some of the most joyful moments you can imagine. And we also celebrate some of the most, and acknowledge some of the most sad versions of stories that we have as well. So it's a place that really captures the emotion of the institution, and for that reason, you know, it was very difficult to leave Marion with that structure not going with us, but it also put more pressure on all of us involved in the project to come up with a space that could match or exceed it, and I'm one that feels that we've done that.
Thank you. So at this point, turn it over to you, the congregation. Any questions you have for any individual panelist or the entire panel?
Don't be shy.
How did the color scheme, this is for anybody who can answer, but how did the color scheme outside come to reflect the inside space, and how did really that come to evolve? I think that the multiple colors going up the sides of the building is something that's become iconic for the school, so can you just touch on that, please?
You know, as Brian's mentioned, we were just one of a series of architects, and we all met together during the design process, which for an architect is really good, because normally you're out front by yourself, but you could watch other people suffer criticism. But what we wanted to do to try and have some sort of unity was to talk about what the materials would be and the colors. And one of the things that was decided that we would use the same, in certain areas, the same concrete masonry unit as a facing material on the outside, which looks a little bit like that's the cream color, that's the limestone. But we knew that because the building is pretty big and it has people, to just have that one color would be too monotonous. So the idea of introducing those gray bandings just to break up the scale of the building helped. And then that sort of overlapped into the palette of the gray for the curtain wall system and some of the materials on the inside as well. So the idea was that the variety was in the buildings that the architects designed, but there was some sort of continuity between some of the materials and colors.
Hi, out of curiosity, when they were designing the chapel, did they take into consideration acoustics as far as how the organ would sound and as far as how music made in here would echo off the walls?
Yeah, acoustics is very important. I mean, one of the things that was not perfect at the old chapel was the acoustics wasn't very good. It had this huge space in the center which was above the altar, and the sound from anybody that was on the altar just went straight upward and was lost because it sort of echoes up in what was the steeple. We had an acoustic consultant, and we had lots of discussions with them about both line of sight, because you don't necessarily appreciate that audibility is enhanced by being able to see someone speak. And we wanted that intimacy anyway. But if you can see someone speaking and you get a line of sight to that, that helps. And then what you also want to do in a large space like this, which has got lots of hard materials, which makes it reverberant, is great for the organ because you get those big booming sounds, but it's terrible for speech. And so we had to strike a balance between that. And what we have here is short distance between anyone who's speaking here and where you are. And that's partly the reason that you get 270 degrees, because it's the shortest distance to talk to 900 people. But also some of the materials, the surfaces on the back wall, which hopefully you don't really notice, are sort of mottled, and it's an acoustic material that absorbs sound, because you don't want sound to bounce more than once or twice. If it bounces, it takes too long to get to your ear, So the direct sound goes straight to you and you hear it. The bound sound comes just a split second later, and there's a dissonance and you can't hear it, muffled sound. So yeah, there was a lot of discussion about talking, but also about the organ and how to get that balance between resonance and reverberation time.
I'd like to add one thing. Those of you that are sitting in the back, I hope, are sitting on cushions, and those of you in the front are not. That was not a budgetary constraint. That was the acoustician saying you need, because the kids are not always going to be sitting in the back there. There's always going to be somebody sitting in the seats here. So put some cushions back there to absorb the sound.
When you're designing a place of faith, or you're involved in projects related to building a place of worship, I'd imagine that your own faiths and your own views on religion would kind of be incorporated into that, or somehow affect some of your decisions. Could any of you really talk about how your own personal faiths kind of drove this project along or affected it? Bob Venturi is a Quaker that's how he was brought up, isn't he? Yeah, yeah. So you have Bob Venturi, a Quaker, and one of the things that I do want to mention is what was really an amazing part of this process is literally there were about 24 people who spent several thousand hours meeting on a weekly basis on this campus, on this process over the course of the year. And there were hundreds and hundreds of others who spent 10 or 20 hours. I mean, the amount of people involved in this was just phenomenal, and it's better because of all of that. I'm Catholic. I went to Episcopal. My sons, Brian and Billy, both went to Episcopal as well. It was important for me that Episcopal Academy never lose its Episcopalness, if you will, and that not just become a Christian academy, but there was something beautiful about being the Episcopal Academy. And that Rush is Episcopalian. So there was a lot of different people. I think all of us, it's hard to say exactly how that would have. This does have kind of a Quaker meeting feel, though, doesn't it? When you think about it a little bit of that. But I think all of us kind of came from that we were people of faith, and some people were Jewish involved with the process, and some people probably weren't religious at all, but had a deep faith in a different way. And I think all of them kind of came through and saw this as important. Just before we pivot, one of my favorite parts of this whole campus is what Bob Venturi did outside over here. And if you read Learning from Las Vegas, you'll see the issue of heroic symbolism and things like this, and not being shy. But he talked about Las Vegas architecture as something to be praised in American architecture. And there is a bit of that when you see those big words, esse quam videre. It's not shy. It says what we are in a really bold way. And I think that's kind of in those like freestanding pillars that just are there almost as monuments to themselves and kind of set the tone. If you were in Rome and you go through certain areas and you see those kind of old columns just there, I mean, they kind of remind me of some of those things. So there's a lot of things, and I encourage you as you're walking around the campus to think, I've been looking at that daily, every day. Let me look at it from a different angle. What was meant by that? Because every detail of it was thought through.
One question from Miss Turner, an English teacher in the upper school. She asked, were you ever daunted, for all of you, in the idea of having a chapel or an institution that was very traditional? And this chapel is very postmodern, but for a school it's very steeped in traditional values.
I don't think I was daunted by the whole project.
Raising the money was the daunting part.
Well, that was easy. Gretchen did it. But I think for me, I mean, I'm Episcopalian, Brian's Catholic. Lou Fryman was my predecessor as chairman, he's Jewish. The chapel was an important thing to him, and he was president of a synagogue. This is not a proselytizing school. We're not trying to convert anybody. So I think it's important that the space be something that makes you think outside yourself. And our community service program and things like that. You don't have to be a Christian to believe in that. So I think this space was intended to get you to look upward. I mean, when I was arguing with Bob about, I'd like to have windows so the kids can see these beautiful trees that we have around here. He says, you're supposed to be thinking otherworldly things in a chapel. You're supposed to look up. But that's, I think, was the design criteria. Not that this is a Catholic institution, an Episcopalian institution. We can't hide from our name. But we're not going to try to convert anybody other than to be a better person and to think outside yourself.
Well, thank you very much. And so with that, conclude the panel of the chapel. To remind you that the exhibition opens next Wednesday night. Mr. Venturi will hopefully most likely be present, and you can field any questions you have there. And thank you very much.
Let's stand and have a concluding prayer, please. Remembering that all of us are here on a shared, and that's the operative word, a shared faith journey. Lord Jesus Christ, make this a temple for your presence, and make this a place that is a house of prayer. Be always near us when we seek you in this place. Draw us to you when we come alone and when we come with a friend, to find comfort and wisdom, to be supported and strengthened, to rejoice and give thanks. May it be here that we are made one with you and with one another, so that our lives are sustained and sanctified for your service. In your most holy name we pray, and together we say, Amen, Amen. Another round of applause for our guests, please. And they're going to stay a bit, so come up and say hello if you're free.
I have a question. The pillar